Book 1, Chapter 3 of the Lancashire Witches. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, a Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 1, Alison Device. Chapter 3 The Asshetons. Between Sir Ralph Assheton of the Abbey and the inhabitants of Whalley, many of whom were his tenants, he being joint lord of the manor with John Braddyll of Portfield, the best possible feeling subsisted; for though somewhat austere in manner, and tinctured with puritanism, the worthy knight was sufficiently shrewd, or more correctly speaking, sufficiently liberal minded, to be tolerant of the opinions of others, and being moreover sincere in his own religious views, no man would call him in question for them. Besides which, he was very hospitable to his friends, very bountiful to the poor, a good landlord, and a humane man. His very austerity of manner, tempered by stately courtesy, added to the respect he inspired, especially as he could now and then relax into gaiety, and when he did so, his smile was accounted singularly sweet. But in general he was grave and formal, stiff in attire and stiff in gait, cold and punctilious in manner, precise in speech, and exacting in due respect from both high and low, which was seldom, if ever, refused him. Among Sir Ralph's other good qualities, for such it was esteemed by his friends and retainers, and they were of course the best judges, was a strong love of the chase, and perhaps he indulged a little too freely in the sports of the field for a gentleman of a character so staid and decorous; but his popularity was far from being diminished by the circumstance. Neither did he suffer the rude and boisterous companionship into which he was brought by indulgence in this his favourite pursuit in any way to affect him. Though still young, Sir Ralph was prematurely grey, and this, combined with the sad severity of his aspect, gave him the air of one considerably past the middle term of life, though this appearance was contradicted again by the youthful fire of his eagle eye. His features were handsome and strongly marked, and he wore a pointed beard and moustaches with a shaved cheek. Sir Ralph Assheton had married twice, his first wife being a daughter of Sir James Beltingham of Levens in Northumberland, by whom he had two children, while his second choice fell upon Eleanor Shuttleworth, the lovely and well endowed heiress of Gawthorpe, to whom he had been recently united. In his attire, even when habited for the chase or a merrymaking, like the present, the Knight of Whalley affected a sombre colour, and ordinarily wore a quilted doublet of black silk, immense trunk hose of the same material stiffened with whalebone, puffed out well wadded sleeves, falling bands, for he eschewed the ruff as savouring of vanity, boots of black flexible leather ascending to the hose, and armed with spurs with gigantic rowels, a round crowned, small brimmed black hat, with an ostrich feather placed in the side and hanging over the top, a long rapier on his hip, and a dagger in his girdle. This buckram attire, it will be easily conceived, contributed no little to the natural stiffness of his tall, thin figure. Sir Ralph Assheton was great grandson of Richard Assheton, who flourished in the time of Abbot Paslew, and who, in conjunction with John Braddyll, 14 years after the unfortunate prelate's attainder and the dissolution of the monastery, had purchased the abbey and domains of Whalley from the crown, subsequently to which a division of the property so granted took place between them, the abbey and part of the manor falling to the share of Richard Assheton, whose descendants had now for 3 generations made it their residence. Thus the whole of Whalley belonged to the families of Assheton and Braddyll, which had intermarried, the latter, as has been stated, dwelling at Portfield, a fine old seat in the neighbourhood. A very different person from Sir Ralph was his cousin, Nicholas Assheton of Downham, who, except as regards his puritanism, might be considered a type of the Lancashire squire of the day. A precision in religious notions, and constant in attendance at church and lecture, he put no sort of restraint upon himself, but mixed up fox hunting, otter hunting, shooting at the mark, and perhaps shooting with the longbow, foot racing, horse racing, and in fact every other kind of country diversion, not forgetting tippling, cards, and dicing, with daily devotion, discourses, and psalm singing in the oddest way imaginable. A thorough sportsman was Squire Nicholas Assheton, well versed in the arts and mysteries of hawking and hunting. Not a man in the county could ride harder, hunt deer, unkennel fox, unearth badger, or spear otter better than he. And then, as to tippling, he would sit you a whole afternoon at the alehouse, and be the merriest man there, and drink a bout with every farmer present. And if the parson chanced to be out of hearing, he would never make a mouth at a round oath, nor choose a second expression when the first would serve his turn. Then, who so constant at church or lecture as Squire Nicholas? Though he did snore sometimes during the long sermons of his cousin, the rector of Middleton. A great man was he at all weddings, christenings, churchings, and funerals, and never neglected his bottle at these ceremonies, nor any sport indoors or out of doors meanwhile. In short, such a roystering Puritan was never known. A good-looking young man was the Squire of Downham, possessed of a very athletic frame, and a most vigorous constitution, which helped him, together with the prodigious exercise he took, through any excess. He had a sanguine complexion, with a broad, good-natured visage, which he could lengthen at will in a surprising manner. His hair was cropped close to his head, and the razor did daily duty over his cheek and chin, giving him the Roundhead look some years later characteristic of the puritanical party. Nicholas had taken to wife Dorothy, daughter of Richard Greenacres of Worston, and was most fortunate in his choice, which is more than can be said for his lady, for I cannot uphold the squire as a model of conjugal fidelity. Report affirmed that he loved more than one pretty girl under the rose. Squire Nicholas was not particular as to the quality or make of his clothes, providing they wore well, and protected him against the weather, and was generally to be seen in doublet and hose of stout fustian, which had seen some service, with a broad-heaved hat, originally green, but of late bleached to a much lighter colour. But he was clad on this particular occasion in ash-coloured habiliments, fresh from the tailor's hands, with buff boots drawn up to the knee, and a new round hat from York with a green feather in it. His legs were slightly embowed, and he bore himself like a man rarely out of the saddle. Downham, the residence of the squire, was a fine old house, very charmingly situated to the north of Pendle Hill, of which it commanded a magnificent view, and a few miles from Clithero. The grounds about it were well wooded, and beautifully broken and diversified, watered by the Ribble, and opening upon the lovely and extensive valley deriving its name from that stream. The house was in good order and well maintained, and the stables plentifully furnished with horses, while the hall was adorned with various trophies and implements of the chase. But as I propose paying its owner a visit, I shall defer any further description of the place till an opportunity arrives for examining it in detail. A third cousin of Sir Ralph's, though in the second degree, likewise present on the May Day in question, was the Reverend Abdias Assheton, rector of Middleton, a very worthy man, who, though differing from his kinsman upon some religious points, and not altogether approving of the conduct of one of them, was on good terms with both. The rector of Middleton was portly and middle-aged, fond of ease and reading, and by no means indifferent to the good things of life. He was unmarried, and passed much of his time at Middleton Hall, the seat of his near relative Sir Richard Assheton, to whose family he was greatly attached, and whose residence closely adjoined the rectory. A fourth cousin also present was young Richard Assheton of Middleton, eldest son and heir of the owner of that estate. Possessed of all the good qualities largely distributed among his kinsmen, with none of their drawbacks, this young man was as tolerant and bountiful as Sir Ralph, without his austerity and sectarianism, as keen a sportsman and as bold a rider as Nicholas, without his propensities to excess, as studious at times, and as well read as Abdias, without his laziness and self-indulgence, and as courtly and well bred as his father, Sir Richard, who was esteemed one of the most perfect gentlemen in the county, without his haughtiness. Then he was the handsomest of his race, though the Asshetons were accounted the handsomest family in Lancashire, and no one minded yielding the palm to young Richard, even if it could be contested, he was so modest and unassuming. At this time Richard Assheton was about 22, tall, gracefully and slightly formed, but possessed of such remarkable vigour that even his cousin Nicholas could scarcely compete with him in athletic exercises. His features were fine and regular, with an almost Phrygian precision of outline. His hair was of a dark brown, and fell in clustering curls over his brown neck. and his complexion was fresh and blooming, and set off by a slight beard and moustache.